$14,300,000 is missing from the Meridian Research Fund, Celine, and every authorization on this table carries your name. Dax Verne, 41-year-old Chief Executive Officer of Verne MedTech Group and husband of Celine, dropped a folder onto the dining room table with enough force to rattle the crystal glasses. Celine Marsh Verne, 36-year-old director of the Elliott Community Health Foundation and wife of Dax, stood at the far end of the table beneath a chandelier that had never felt colder. Her chair beside her husband was gone. Portia Alcott, 32-year-old director of strategic partnerships at Verne MedTech Group and mistress of Dax, occupied it instead, a glass of burgundy held loosely in her hand as though she had always belonged there. No one had touched the food. The dinner had never been about food. Rowena Verne, 66-year-old matriarch of the Verne family and mother-in-law of Celine, stared from across the table with an expression she did not bother to hide. Chester Verne, 70-year-old founder of Verne MedTech Group and father of Dax, sat at the head of the table with his jaw locked and his eyes fixed on the folder. Two board members flanked him, invited not as family but as witnesses. Inside the folder were financial records Celine had never seen, transfers she had never authorized, and a non-profit registration bearing a name close enough to her foundations to be mistaken at a glance. Elliott Community Outreach. Her passport details appeared on the registration. An old signature lifted from a grant application appeared on the vendor approval form. "I didn't create those records," Celine said. Dax did not look at her. The audit trail says otherwise. What Dax did not know, what no one at that table knew, was that Celine Marsh Verne was also Celine Marsh Elliott, the controlling beneficiary of the Elliott Health Continuity Trust, a private entity that held 68% of Crestline Medical Partners, a healthcare credentialing and network management group valued at $1.8 billion. Crestline processed every insurance claim Verne MedTech submitted. Crestline credentialed every physician on their telehealth platform. Crestline held the licensing agreements that made their hospital contracts enforceable. Without Crestline's continued cooperation, Verne MedTech could not bill a single patient, verify a single provider, or activate a single contract they had signed. Dax believed he was trapping a charity director with no resources of her own. He had never read the sealed disclosure attached to their marriage agreement. Earlier that afternoon, Celine had been standing outside the Kemper Street Free Clinic when her phone vibrated. She had spent 12 weeks writing the grant renewal that kept the clinic's overnight shift funded. 24 patients were waiting inside, most of them uninsured, several of them elderly. Cecily, 53-year-old senior program coordinator of the foundation and 22-year veteran of its daily operations, had been managing intake alone since 6 that morning. The waiting room was full, and the afternoon sun was sharp against the glass door. Dax's message arrived without a greeting. "Meridian audit flags are back. Get to the office before 4. I need your sign-off on the remediation file." Celine looked through the clinic window. Cecily was handing a man a numbered slip and explaining carefully that the wait would be another hour. She typed back, "How many patients are affected if the billing error isn't corrected tonight?" His response took 40 seconds. "Everyone on the Hartwell contract, 1,200 patients." Celine asked a volunteer to cover intake and drove downtown. Inside Verne MedTech's operations room, Emmett Cord, 47-year-old head of finance and closest professional ally of Dax, handed her a thick binder. The billing clearinghouse, he said, had flagged irregularities in the Hartwell reimbursement file. Crestline was rejecting the claims batch. 1,200 people were waiting on insurance authorizations that would not release until the error was resolved. Celine sat down and opened the binder. Within 20 minutes, she found the source, a provider taxonomy code mismatch compounded across 3 billing cycles. She also found something else. A vendor line item labeled Meridian Research Coordination had been charged to the foundation's grant account in amounts that matched no contract she had ever reviewed or approved. She flagged it. Emmett gave a short laugh. "Corporate grant accounting is a little more layered than community clinic work." Celine looked up from the page. "A charge with no contract isn't layered, it's unexplained." She corrected the taxonomy codes. By evening, Crestline processed the claims batch, and the Hartwell patients received their billing confirmations. Dax walked onto the operations floor, thanked the billing team, and told them the fix had taken real leadership. He did not mention Celine. She was already gathering her bag to return to Cecily. She never made it. Another message arrived. "Family dinner tonight, 7 o'clock. Mother says it's time to settle things." Celine thought he meant their marriage, which had been unraveling for 2 years. She had been preparing to tell him the truth about Crestline before their 9th anniversary, A sealed letter sat inside her foundation desk, explaining everything: her full name, the trust, her father's decision to remove her from public records after a threat against her at 19, the security restrictions that had expired only 6 weeks prior. She had wanted him to know before the law required full disclosure. She put the letter in her bag that evening. She thought, perhaps, there was still time for one honest conversation. There was not. She had understood what kind of dinner this would be for 3 weeks, ever since she returned to the building after hours to retrieve grant files and heard voices through Dax's private office door. Portia's hand rested inside his jacket. Dax wore the watch Celine had given him on their 6th anniversary. That alone would have ended what remained between them. But the second sentence she heard changed everything. Once the foundation is implicated, Portia said, the auditors will stop looking at us. Dax pulled her closer. Celine has no real assets, no real connections. If we build the paper trail correctly, she becomes the obvious answer. On his desk, through the gap in the door, Celine saw copies of her passport, an old signature card from a grant file, a flash drive marked with the foundation's colors. She photographed the desk before Dax saw her reflection in the glass. She did not confront him. She called Torben Alt, 50-year-old financial crime attorney and longtime legal advisor to her family trust, that same night. Torben told her to change the foundation's security codes, document every missing identity record, preserve every communication, and not to face the Verne family without him present. They may be preparing more than a divorce, he said. He was right. The criminal complaint had already been filed 4 days earlier. Dax had arranged the dinner after learning that the arrest warrant was already issued. The dinner was brief in the way that traps are brief. Dax laid out the case against her with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it. The Meridian Research Fund had been drained through a shell vendor tied to a non-profit that bore her foundation's name and her identifying documents. Board members were present to make the accusation appear official. Rowena, who had spent 9 years finding polished ways to communicate that Celine did not belong in the family, provided the moral framing. You came into this house pretending to need nothing, she said. All along you were learning how to take what wasn't yours. Bryn Verne, 27-year-old communications manager at Verne MedTech and younger sister of Dax, sat at the far end of the table and did not speak. She had been watching Portia since the dinner began. Her expression had not changed since the moment Celine walked in and found her chair missing. Grant Wexler, 58-year-old Verne family attorney, placed a divorce petition beside the fraud documents. Dax's signature was already on it. Alongside it sat a proposed settlement: surrender the marital home, waive financial claims, accept responsibility for the missing funds, remain silent about the Verne family. Celine read every page. She signed the acknowledgement confirming she had received the divorce petition. She signed the written consent stating that the marriage should end. Then she pushed the proposed settlement back across the table. I agreed to end this marriage, she said. I will not sign a confession for a theft you manufactured. Dax's expression hardened. He began reworking the history of their marriage in front of his family. Every time Celine had questioned a financial decision became evidence that she understood how to hide money. Every boundary she had set around the foundation became proof she had been protecting access to it. Rowena looked at her with open contempt. Portia smiled at the side of the table that had always been hers. Then Celine looked directly at Portia. Does everyone here know you've been sleeping with my husband? No one spoke. Dax did not deny it. Portia understands the pressure I carry, he said. She understands this world in a way you never did. Before Celine could respond, an estate security officer carried her handbag to the table. It had been taken briefly to a coat room when she arrived. Rowena emptied it. Keys, wallet, foundation badge, a sealed packet of tissues. Then a flash drive fell out. Portia identified it immediately, before anyone opened it, before anyone examined it, as the drive containing the fraudulent grant records. Celine turned toward her. You know the contents without looking at it. Portia's certainty faltered for exactly 1 second. I recognize the drive, its foundation equipment. Bryn stared at the device. She had seen Portia carrying an identical drive 2 weeks earlier, inside this same building. She parted her lips. Rowena's hand closed around her wrist beneath the table. One sentence could collapse everything, Rowena whispered. Bryn lowered her eyes and said nothing. 2 minutes later, the dining room doors opened. Detective Greta Fenn, 44-year-old financial crimes investigator assigned to the fraud case, entered with 2 officers and a warrant bearing a date 5 days prior. As the officer placed restraints around Celine's wrists, Torben entered through the hallway, identified himself as counsel, and instructed the officers to preserve the drive's chain of custody, the coat room entry log, and every original document included in the warrant package. Celine looked toward him. Notify Myla. Trigger the independent review on all Vern Medtech accounts. Recusal only, no operational interference from me. Emmett's face changed when he heard the phrase independent review. He did not understand it yet. Dax only smiled, still believing Celine was performing a bluff with nothing behind it. Outside, camera flashes appeared beyond the dining room windows. Dax had arranged photographers at the estate gates before the officers arrived. The holding cell had a narrow bench and a television mounted behind the bars that carried the segment about her arrest. The report described her as a charity director who had used her marriage to a prominent healthcare entrepreneur to access research funding she had then redirected into private accounts. The images the Vern family had supplied showed Dax at the center of every photograph, Celine always at the edge. The report did not mention that a second transfer, $6 million, had been initiated while Celine was already seated at the dinner table, surrounded by the Vern family, their board members, and estate staff. It did not mention the coat room. It did not mention that the warrant had been filed before the evidence it cited was supposedly found. She had hidden enough wealth to purchase the news station that ran the segment. None of it could remove the image of Dax reaching for Portia's hand while the restraints closed around her own wrists. She remembered sitting beside her father, Piers Elliott, 66-year-old founder of Crestline Medical Partners, inside the original operations center he had built from a single rural medical practice. He had placed a patient billing file on the table between them and said, "Every number in here belongs to a real person sitting somewhere frightened. When you work in this industry, you owe that person accuracy before anything else." He had also removed her from every public record associated with Crestline the week after she was followed from a university library at 19. A financial magazine had printed her name alongside his. 2 men had waited near her car. Piers pulled her from all succession documentation within days. She began using her mother's surname, Marsh. The trust's structure was sealed under regulatory agreements known only to trustees and senior officers. She had lived without the inheritance attached to her name because the inheritance had once nearly taken everything from her. Before marrying Dax, she had disclosed that she held a protected premarital trust. He signed the agreement without reading the sealed disclosure. He assumed modest investment accounts. She had not told him a direct lie. She had hidden the scale of it because the security restrictions were still active and because she wanted once to know that a man could love Celine before discovering what Celine owned. For the first 3 years of their marriage, she had believed Dax was that man. He had helped her load supply boxes at a community health fair when his company was underfunded and still unproven. He had eaten a cold sandwich with her in a parking lot and told her he didn't care what her family had left her. He cared what she would build. She had believed him. Later, the startup grew and his gratitude faded. Her financial corrections became threats to his authority. The foundation became, in his vocabulary, her hobby. He stopped defending her when Rowena made cutting remarks at family gatherings. After Portia joined the company, his phone went private and his schedule became a closed door, and every difficult question Celine asked became proof that she was the source of his problems. She had delayed telling him about Crestline through every crisis that appeared. Now, she understood. She had been waiting for a version of him that had already stopped existing. Torben worked without stopping. Myla Ashton, 55-year-old Chief Compliance Officer of Crestline Medical Partners and one of Piers Elliott's most trusted former colleagues, ran the independent forensic review without Celine's involvement. Celine had formally recused herself from every operational decision involving Vern Medtech accounts. She could not freeze transfers, alter access credentials, or direct the investigation's outcome. The record did it without her. Portia's administrative credentials had created the Shell vendor account. The fraudulent filings used a provider code sequence, accessible only through Vern Medtech's executive billing portal. The flash drive had been purchased through a company equipment order that Portia had authorized. Building access logs placed Portia inside the coat room at the Vern estate for 4 minutes before Celine's bag was searched. The $6 million transfer initiated during the dinner had been approved using Dax's physical security token. Building records placed him inside his private office. During the 3 minutes, he excused himself to take a phone call. The signature on the Shell nonprofit's registration matched an old grant filing with identical ink pressure across both documents. No human hand produces the same signature twice with identical pressure distribution. The match was a copy, not a repetition. Bryn had been photographing things on her phone for 2 weeks and sending nothing. The morning after the arrest, she came to Torben's office in person. She sat with her hands flat on the table and said, "I saw Portia go into the coat room. I watched Dax review the public statement accusing Celine 3 days before the dinner. I knew the police were already coming." Her voice did not shake. She was done letting it shake. When Celine met with her, Bryn said only, "I should have spoken before they put the restraints on you." Celine listened without interrupting. "You eventually told the truth," she said. "That matters." Then after a moment, "It doesn't change what your silence cost while it was happening." Bryn accepted both things without defense. The fraud charges against Celine were reviewed by the prosecutor's office within 3 weeks and dismissed. The warrant's probable cause had been built on fabricated source materials. The dismissal entered the public record the same morning Dax arrived at Verne Medtech expecting a normal workday. His keycard cleared the front door. His coffee was on his desk. Then he opened the provider credentialing dashboard. Account access suspended, credentials under independent fraud review. Contact Crestline compliance for account status. He tried the billing clearinghouse portal. The same message, the licensing access, suspended. The Hartwell contract management system, suspended. Every Crestline adjacent platform his company depended on had removed his authorization within the same overnight window. He called Crestline's executive line. A risk officer named Silas answered and explained that the independent review had flagged active executive credentials as compromised. Access could not be restored while forensic review remained open. "I've been a Crestline client for 6 years. That history is documented. It doesn't change the present risk." Dax stared at the screen. Without Crestline, Verne Medtech could not credential a physician, process an insurance claim, or enforce a hospital contract. The company's operations had not been seized. They had simply been made to wait for a man the system no longer recognized as trustworthy. The token in his hand was no longer a key. It was a piece of metal attached to the name of someone the institution had decided it could not afford to trust. His fingers began to shake. Chester arrived with a printed report and the first question he had ever asked his son in a tone that carried no defense. "What did you do?" The Crestline boardroom was long and still. A screen behind the chairman's position displayed the forensic map, shell vendor payments flowing into luxury accounts, provider records altered across 3 billing cycles, the fabricated non-profit registration, the coatroom timestamp, the dinner timeline, the flash drive purchase order, the $6 million transfer initiated from Dax's token, while Celine sat surrounded by his own family's witnesses. Dax sat beside Chester and Rowena with a security token that no longer opened anything. Portia sat across the room with her attorney. Emmett had arrived under separate counsel. Bryn sat with her hands folded and did not look at her brother. Broderick Joss, 71-year-old chairman of Crestline Medical Partners and a former colleague of Piers Elliott, stood at the head of the table. He had known Celine since she was a girl learning to read billing codes in her father's back office. "Crestline has served Verne Medtech for 6 years," he said. "That relationship required care. It did not require blindness." He looked toward Dax. "You wanted to speak with the person who authorized the independent review." He glanced toward the closed doors at the far end of the room. They opened. Celine entered beside Torben and Myla. She wore a grey blazer and her father's old Crestline lapel pin, the one he had pressed into her palm the day he formally transferred the trust. She did not smile. She did not hurry. She took the seat at the opposite end of the table from Dax and set her recusal document on the surface in front of her. Rowena stiffened. Chester looked at Celine's face and went very still. Broderick rose from his chair. Every Crestline director rose with him. "Celine Marsh Elliott," he said, "controlling beneficiary of the Elliott Health Continuity Trust, principal owner of Crestline Medical Partners." The room had no immediate answer. Rowena made a short, disbelieving sound. Chester studied Celine's face the way a person looks at something they have seen before in a different context. Slowly, and then all at once. "You're Piers Elliott's daughter," he said. "Yes." Dax looked at her from the other end of the table, and Celine watched him rebuild 9 years of marriage through a lens he had never held before. Her precise knowledge of Crestline's billing systems, her familiarity with credentialing law, the sealed disclosure he had signed without reading, every competence he had converted into a reason to dismiss her, now reassembled itself into something he could not explain away. "You lied to me," he said. "I told you before our wedding that I held a protected premarital trust. You signed the disclosure without opening it." Celine's voice did not waver. "I kept the scale of my inheritance private because the law required it for years, And because I wanted to know whether you could love me before knowing what I owned." She looked at him steadily. "I was wrong to keep that, as long as I did. I should have told you the moment the restriction ended. But I concealed the size of an inheritance. You built a criminal case around my name and arranged my arrest in front of photographers you had stationed at your own gate. Those are not equivalent failures." Dax had no answer. Myla activated the transaction display. The forensic report ran for 20 minutes. When it finished, Crestline's independent board voted without delay. Remove Dax and Portia from all system authorizations, refer the complete evidence package to the Criminal Fraud Division, place Vern Medtech's accounts under supervised restructuring, and protect employee payroll and patient service access throughout all pending proceedings. Before leaving the room to allow the board to deliberate, Celine had submitted one instruction: protect the Hartwell patients, protect the clinic billing accounts, protect every staff member who had nothing to do with any of this. She asked the board not to use her ownership as a tool of punishment against the company's ordinary operations. "I want the truth followed," she said, "not revenge wearing the name of policy." The criminal charges came 3 weeks later. Dax entered the courthouse beside his attorney while cameras filled the steps. Portia had already agreed to cooperate with prosecutors after finding, inside a locked drawer in Dax's home office, a contingency file he had prepared to transfer the full weight of the scheme onto her if his first account failed. Emmett admitted to manipulating the financial reports after consulting with his attorney. Rowena came to Torben's office and asked to speak with Celine privately. Her apology began, "If I had known who your father was, I would never have treated you the way I did." Celine stopped her there. "The person you treated the way you did deserved consideration before you knew what she owned." Rowena lowered her eyes. Bryn came separately and without agenda. She said she should have spoken at the table, that the words had been in her throat, that she had let her mother's hand on her wrist make the decision for her. "You told the truth," Celine said. "That still matters then. It doesn't change what it cost." Bryn left without asking for more than that. The divorce was finalized on the same afternoon as the arraignment. The settlement Dax had prepared, the one that required Celine's silence and her confession, was never filed. The court received instead her formal response: consent to dissolution, rejection of every fabricated allegation, and a request for full preservation of the financial evidence that told the real story. She kept the name Marsh. Her mother had given it to her the year after the incident outside the library, the year both of them learned that her father's name could attract the wrong kind of attention. She had kept it through a marriage, and through a fraud investigation, and through a boardroom where she finally stopped keeping it hidden. It still fit the work she did. The clinic nights, the grant filings, the billing corrections that let 1,200 patients see their doctors on time. At the Foundation's next board meeting, Celine placed her father's lapel pin on the table beside a new program proposal: legal and financial support for individuals whose identities had been used to construct cases against them. Cecily sat across from her with the program documents already reviewed and annotated. The sealed anniversary letter Celine had once prepared for, Dax stayed in her desk drawer. Beside it she placed the final divorce order. One document was the truth she had hoped to share. The other was the marriage he had ended before she ever had the chance to share it. She closed the drawer. That morning, before the board meeting began, she had walked through Crestline's operations floor while the overnight team finished the billing cycle. Credentialing submissions, insurance claim batches, provider network verifications, all of it moving quietly through systems her father had built from one rural practice and she had inherited and nearly lost the right to protect. The room was unhurried. No alarms, no red screens, no access revocations, just the ordinary work of keeping 1,200 patients connected to the care they had been promised. Near the building's east entrance, a courier intake had received a new file before sunrise, marked urgent and addressed to her by name. Across the top, handwritten on a standard routing slip, identity used to falsify healthcare billing records. Employee has no resources for legal counsel. Requesting Foundation assistance. Celine picked it up on her way to the elevator. Her marriage had ended. Her hiding had ended. But the truth, it turned out, already knew where she worked.